Hello, this is your review for your exponential functions for 6.3 and 6.4 quiz. And we will be starting off by going over the domain and range of exponential functions. So you see your four different type of exponential functions here. You have A is positive, A is negative, A is positive, A is negative, B is less than 1, B is less than 1, B is greater than 1, B is greater than 1. And those are the four scenarios that can happen. All right, so if I have to find the domain and range of each function, remember, the domain is where my picture exists along the x-axis, or the left and right. My range is where my picture exists along the y-axis, or top to bottom. And let me rephrase that, should be bottom to top. So I'm going to graph my first function. You can use Desmos and look at the picture on Desmos. I'm going to do it on graph paper just to show you can do it either way. So there's my y-axis. I'll try and make that a little darker for you. Here is my x-axis. Now your graph will be perfect on Desmos, but if you're doing it on this, it doesn't have to be perfect. And I will use a marker to try and make it come in a little bit better. So when you graph this, hopefully you remember, this is always your y-intercept. So I know I'm going to start at y equals 2. And then, since this is less than 1, this number will be going down this way with an asymptote at 0. The asymptote means I get very, very close, but I never hit it. So this is the general form for this equation. And let me get that in there so you can see the arrow. There should be an arrow up top. Now, if I'm going to describe the domain and range of this, the domain is how far left and right you go. Well, as you notice with the arrows, this picture proceeds as far left as you can imagine and as far right as you can imagine. So that means I'm using every x along this number line. In other words, my domain is all real numbers. So I use every x possible. But since my A is positive, this graph exists only above the y-axis. So if it's above the y-axis and never hits 0 because I have an asymptote, I call my range all the y values greater than 0. So again, domain deals from left to right, range deals from bottom to top. So left to right, every number possible, bottom to top, all the numbers greater than 0 is where this picture exists. Now let's look at number 22. So 22, I'll draw the graph again. Try and make this. There we go. Now this graph, A tells me, since it's negative, it's going to exist below the y-axis. And since that is less than 1, I will be approaching 0. So it'll look something like this. I know I go through negative 2. Again, I don't have numbers and stuff on my graph, but it should be pretty obvious what's happening here. Now, my domain, again, and is what will happen with all of our exponential functions, they all exist as far left as you can imagine and as far right as you can imagine. So my domain, again, is all real numbers. My range this time, though, my picture exists below 0. If it exists below 0, then my y is less than 0. And what that means is I'm dealing with all the y's down here. My picture exists, or all my y values from this function will always be less than 0. Now I'm on to number 23. So those are your pictures for 21 and 22. And again, you should graph these both on Desmos, and you will get pictures very comparable to this. 23. Well, 23 has an a of 2, so I know that is my y-intercept. And since this number is greater than 1, it's going to be going up as I move to the right. So I have an asymptote at 0, and I move up as I go that direction. So just as we've seen this entire time, my domain, it extends as far right and as far left as you can imagine. So my domain is always all real numbers for exponential functions. Other functions it won't be, but for this case, it'll be all real numbers. My range, this is just like the first one, except it's going in a different direction. But we don't care about that when we're talking about domain and range. All I care about is where does this picture exist going from bottom to top. If I was to describe to you where is this graph, it is all the numbers greater than 0, or all the y's greater than 0. So now my range is y is greater than 0. Again, it's not equal to because we have an asymptote at the x-axis, so this graph never hits 0. It gets as close as you can imagine, but never hits. Now, for 24. As I look at 24, I have a y-intercept at -2. And since that is bigger than 1, it's going to look like this. So now, as I look at my domain and range, my domain goes as far left and as far right as possible. My domain is all real numbers because it's as far left and as far right as you can imagine. And if you notice, I probably should have done this one in green. All of my domain is all real numbers. It will always be all real numbers for all of our exponential functions. Our ranges are the only things we have to be careful of. If it's below the y-axis, my range is y is less than 0. Okay? So the pictures that were below the y-axis, it's y less than 0 because I'm talking about these y values less than 0, or I'm talking about negative numbers. All the y is less than 0. So that takes you through the first 4 problems in the domain and range of exponential functions. So the best way to do this always is to graph it on Desmos and describe the graph. The domain describes the left and the right. The range describes vertically from bottom to top. Thank you, and this will continue on the next clip.